The skies above the Netherlands roared like 1,000 drums. It was the 17th of September, 1944, the opening day of Operation Market Garden. The largest airborne assault the world had ever seen was now underway, with more than 34,000 paratroopers dropping into Axis-occupied territory. Below, the Dutch countryside was burning. German 88 seconds fired blindly into the clouds, trying to disrupt the waves of C-47 seconds and their precious human cargo. Flak exploded in black blossoms. Chaos reigned. But high above that chaos, past the thick clouds and deadly flak belts, one lone fighter made an impossible maneuver. It was a P-51 Mustang, known for its range, speed, and brutal elegance. Yet this one wasn't diving, turning, or banking. It was climbing, straight up. No boost, no rockets, just throttle and torque. And it wasn't supposed to happen. Not at this altitude, not at this load, and definitely not against gravity's will. Radio chatter burst to life. Red 2. How the hell are you doing that? No answer. Only static. Then a voice. Calm, flat, Midwestern. Just a little tweak. That tweak was something the brass had ignored. Something maintenance crews dismissed. And something enemy pilots, just minutes later, would come to fear. The pilot's name was Lieutenant Harold Hal McIntyre, a 2-3-year-old former crop duster from Iowa. He wasn't the most decorated ace. He hadn't come from West Point, but he had something better. A mind that didn't accept impossible. And inside that engine cowling, just behind the blades and below the intake, was a piece of engineering that didn't exist on any schematic. A hand-built, zero-boost airflow redirect a homebrew mod that allowed McIntyre's Merlin engine to cheat atmospheric pressure for a few glorious seconds. That morning, German radar picked up unusual energy spikes near Arnhem. Luftwaffe interceptors were scrambled. The Me, 109 seconds, arrived too late. The Me 262 seconds, Germany's pride, arrived just in time to witness their prey climbing vertically into the sun. At 17,000 feet, McIntyre did the unthinkable. His Mustang, already past its optimal performance ceiling, surged again another 1,000 feet in seconds. One Luftwaffe pilot later wrote in his debrief, "It was not a plane. It was a rocket disguised as a Mustang." On the ground, Allied paratroopers cheered as they saw the silhouette of the Mustang overhead, a symbol that someone, somehow, still had air superiority in a sky full of jet fighters. That zero-boost climb changed everything. It wasn't in the manuals. It wasn't cleared by engineering. But it worked. And in the fog of war, results talk louder than doctrine. Harold McIntyre wasn't supposed to be a fighter pilot. In fact, he almost didn't make it through basic. The instructors at Tuskegee Field nicknamed him Farmer Hal, not because of his roots in rural Iowa, but because of the way he flew, low, rough, and unpredictable. To his superiors, he was a risk, but to the mechanics and ground crews, he was something else entirely, a genius in overalls. While other cadets focused on formation drills and aerial combat theory, McIntyre was in the maintenance hangar, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in engine grease. He didn't care much for ranks or ribbons. What he cared about was airflow, compression, and heat dispersion. More than once, he was written up for unauthorized modifications, to training aircraft modifications that, oddly enough, usually improved performance. It was that obsession with engine dynamics that nearly got him kicked out. But in 1944, with pilots in short supply and the war escalating, the Army Air Forces made a rare exception. They let him fly. "Keep him pointed at the enemy," one colonel said, "and maybe he'll crash into something useful." His first deployment was Italy, where he flew escort missions for B-24 seconds. But McIntyre quickly became frustrated. The P-51 seconds were fast. Sure, but at high altitude, fully loaded, and without boost, they handled like stubborn mules. He began experimenting in secret, running calculations at night, sneaking into motor pools to test airflow theory. One afternoon, a mechanic found him under a P-51's nose cone with a hacksaw, reshaping a section of the intake. When asked what the hell he was doing, McIntyre simply said, "Making it breathe like it wants to." He called it the Zero Boost Climb mod, a redirection of pressure that allowed the Merlin engine to momentarily act like it was still at sea level even at 10,000 feet. The mod wasn't in the flight manuals. It wasn't even legal. But after testing it on a damaged training frame and seeing the climb rate double, McIntyre knew he was onto something. But no one believed him, not the officers, not the flight engineers. To them, it was just another Farmer Hal experiment. That is, until Operation Market Garden. Until that one mission, that one vertical takeoff, turned a misfit into a legend. From the cockpit of his P-51 held together with duct tape, prayer, and one illegal airflow mod, Harold McIntyre proved that sometimes what the military calls reckless is just innovation in disguise. At the heart of the P-51 Mustang's legendary performance was the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a V16507, 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled monster that changed the tide of the air war. But even legends have limits, and one of the Merlin's most stubborn constraints was altitude performance without boost. Normally, when climbing above 10,000 feet, a pilot needed to engage the engine's two-stage, two-speed supercharger to maintain manifold pressure. Without it, the air became too thin, robbing the engine of oxygen, reducing combustion efficiency, and ultimately strangling its ability to climb. Most pilots accepted this as gospel. But McIntyre? He called it a lazy excuse. He believed the issue wasn't just about power, it was about airflow behavior, turbulence, and how pressure stacked inside the intake. During long, sleepless nights stationed near the Belgian border, he sketched airflow patterns on the back of ration boxes, trying to find a way to cheat the laws of altitude. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a broken radiator cowling. After a field mission where flak tore through his intake duct, McIntyre noticed his plane responding oddly, surging forward at mid-altitude without the usual boost drag. Back on the ground, he didn't report the damage. Instead, he took measurements. The disrupted airflow, it seemed, had created a secondary pressure zone that momentarily stabilized oxygen density before combustion. That was all the confirmation he needed. Over the next several weeks, McIntyre quietly worked on a crude series of modifications. Slight bends in the duct lining, a set of venting holes drilled at precise angles, and most controversially a hand-cut insert crafted from a crushed mess tin. The goal? To channel air through a turbulent pressure ring that created just enough backflow to trick the engine into thinking it was still flying low and fast. When he tested it during non-combat maneuvers, the results were staggering. From a standing start at 4,000 feet, his modified P-51 shot up to 5,200 inches under 4 seconds without touching the boost control. His climb rate had nearly doubled, all while keeping the engine within operational temperature. He called it zero boost climbing, though it was more of a sleight of hand than an actual mechanical removal of boost. What made it controversial was its simplicity. The entire modification required no special tools, no extra weight, and no new parts. It was, in theory, something any squadron could have done. And that's what made the brass hate it. If an unauthorized mechanic and a low-ranking pilot could outperform regulation protocols, what did that say about the doctrine? Command told him to stop. He didn't. They wrote him up. He threw the paperwork in the trash. Because McIntyre wasn't looking for glory, he was looking for altitude. And with Operation Market Garden looming, that altitude might be the only thing that stood between survival and a cockpit full of flak. The 17th of September, 1944. The morning sky over the Netherlands was painted with streaks of C-47 seconds, dragging gliders and paratroopers into enemy territory. Operation Market Garden, one of the most ambitious airborne assaults of World War II, was now in motion, and flying escort above it all was First Lieutenant Evan McIntyre, strapped into his P-51 Mustang, ready to put his so-called zero-boost climb to the ultimate test. As Allied transport planes flew into flak-rich airspace, Luftwaffe fighters began to descend from high altitudes, a classic ambush tactic. The German jets and FW-192s weren't looking to dogfight. They were aiming to punch holes through the slow-moving formation of transports, turn them into flying coffins, and stall the Allied ground advance. The clock was ticking. McIntyre's squadron had orders to fly defensive racetrack patterns, maintaining altitude above the transports and intercepting incoming threats. But when radar chatter picked up 9 bogies breaking formation at 17,000 feet descending fast, McIntyre realized the old tactics wouldn't work. They were outnumbered, outclimbed, and out-timed. A conventional pursuit using the 2-stage supercharger would be too slow. By the time any pilot reached interception altitude, the Luftwaffe would already have made their first strike. That's when McIntyre hit the switch, or rather, didn't. Instead of engaging the boost, he flipped his modified airflow ducts into position and throttled forward at 8,500 feet. His engine roared, but not in a way anyone expected. Within 2 seconds, the P-51 surged like it had been yanked by a catapult. The nose pitched up, and he hit 10,000 feet. Another 2 seconds, 12,000 feet. No boost, no lag. Just raw climb. His wingmen radioed in disbelief. "You're in stall zone," one of them shouted. McIntyre didn't answer. He couldn't. The G-forces pressing into his chest were crushing. His blood pounded in his ears as the Mustang tore through thin air, hitting 1,000 feet per second on climb, a record not even the Me-262 could touch at the time. The German pilots weren't ready. One Me-109 peeled off and banked hard to intercept, but McIntyre had already overflown him. He caught the formation from underneath, an angle they didn't expect, and opened fire. Tracers ripped through one jet's fuselage. The German exploded mid-air, not from the rounds, but from sheer panic as his wing tore under too much pressure during evasive dive. The remaining 8 jets scattered, and that alone bought the transports critical seconds. McIntyre swung his plane back around, still climbing without boost, and locked onto a second Me-262 attempting a side attack. This time, the enemy tried to climb away but couldn't. McIntyre's Mustang had gained 1,500 feet before the Germans' afterburner even lit. 2 kills confirmed. The rest of the squadron rallied behind him, inspired or maybe stunned into action. Together, they forced the rest of the jets to abandon the strike run entirely. That day, the Allies lost fewer transports than expected. And while credit went to the squadron as a whole, everyone knew who made the breakout possible. The mechanic, with a food can airflow patch, and the pilot crazy enough to trust it. McIntyre's Mustang returned with one fuel line scorched, and his intake cowling nearly warped from the pressure. But the engine? It hadn't overheated once. The impossible had just been made routine at 10,000 feet. When First Lieutenant McIntyre landed at the forward airbase near Eindhoven, ground crews scrambled around his P-51 Mustang with a mix of confusion and awe. The engine block was hot, but not cooked. The modified air ducts showed clear warping from the pressure spikes during ascent, and the fuselage bore stress marks, yet everything held. No blown cylinders, no burst lines, no overboost damage, just a plane that had done the impossible, and a mechanics mod that no manual ever endorsed. News of McIntyre's climb and the shoot-downs spread like wildfire through the Allied ranks. But just as fast as admiration rose from fellow pilots, condemnation rolled in from above. High Command didn't appreciate improvisation that exposed the limits of their doctrine. Within 24 hours, McIntyre was summoned to a briefing with group leadership. What should have been a debriefing about tactical success turned into an interrogation. "Lieutenant, under whose authority did you authorize modifications to your supercharger intake?" McIntyre stood silent at first, then calmly replied, "My mechanic saw an airflow anomaly and corrected it. That mechanic isn't a certified engineer. He bent regulation to jam food can metal into a high-performance machine. And it saved 9 transport planes. The room went cold. But the colonel wasn't done. "You made a spectacle, Lieutenant. Now every hotshot thinks he can tape soup cans to his engine and call it a breakthrough." What they couldn't say, but every pilot in the room knew, was that McIntyre had embarrassed them. His insane climb exposed that their standard settings, with all their manuals and command doctrines, had left room for better performance that nobody had tested. No one wanted to admit that a ground mechanic's field hack had outperformed the factory specs. Later that evening, McIntyre's mechanic Corporal Sid Rafferty was pulled aside by a tech officer. "We're sending a formal report to Engineering Command. You may be cited for unauthorized modifications." Sid just shrugged. "You can court-martial me. But if I hadn't bent that intake, the Luftwaffe would have cut that convoy in half." Within days, Sid was transferred out, reassigned to a depot. No one said it directly, but the message was clear. His brilliance had embarrassed someone higher up. Meanwhile, McIntyre's Mustang was grounded for inspection. The intake mod was removed, the old configuration restored. And when McIntyre tested the climb again under standard boost, he barely hit 11,000 feet in 18 seconds. Nowhere near what he'd done during Market Garden. The punishment stung, but what hurt more was the silence from command. No official recognition, no medal for the kills, no commendation for saving Allied lives. It was as if the climb never happened. As if the system preferred mediocrity over innovation because innovation meant admitting they hadn't done enough. But the pilots talked. In every briefing room from Belgium to Berlin, they whispered about the zero-boost climb. Some tried to replicate it. Others failed. But everyone knew, that day, over Holland, one man flew higher, faster, and smarter because he trusted the mechanic who bent the rules. McIntyre didn't fly that modified Mustang again, but the legend of that 4-second, 1,000-foot climb spread like wildfire, not through the pages of official reports, but through the mouths of those who watched it happen. And for Sid Rafferty, transferred far from the front, his tools stripped and his name buried in paperwork, that was enough. While McIntyre's Mustang was quietly stripped of its battlefield upgrade, the reverberations of his record-breaking climb refused to die. Pilots were talking. Words spread across airfields from the dusty forward bases of Belgium to the sprawling airstrips in southern England that a P-51, one of the fastest fighters of the war, had been pushed beyond what anyone thought possible. Not in a lab, not in a wind tunnel, but over a battlefield in real combat. Back in England, a test pilot named Howard Ellison was one of the first to hear the rumors. He'd flown every variant of the P-51, from the B model to the latest D5NA. He knew the specs inside and out, but the reports he was hearing from Holland made no sense. 4-second climb? 1,000 feet? No dive acceleration? It didn't compute. Ellison pulled some strings and got hold of the post-mission flight logs. There was no official recording of the mod. The mechanic's name wasn't even mentioned. But the climb rate stood out. The RPM spikes. The fuel burn. The unexplainable power. That's when Ellison knew. Someone had rewritten the rule book, and HQ had buried it. So, he did what test pilots do best. He recreated it. Using a mock-up of the air intake housing, he asked his engineering crew to simulate restricted airflow under heat stress. After multiple failed attempts, they stumbled on a variable angle restrictor system, close to what McIntyre's mechanic had described. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't standard, but the numbers were clear. With the mod in place, their test Mustang hit a vertical climb rate 28% higher than baseline. But here was the kicker. It only worked for bursts under 6 seconds. Any longer, and the engine threatened to overheat or misfire. It wasn't sustainable. But for combat, it was golden. Word of this quiet discovery began to ripple across RAF circles too. One British engineer stationed at Boscombe Down quipped in a classified memo, "It appears the Yanks stumbled on a ghetto version of a dynamic ram intake." Accidentally brilliant. The RAF never officially adopted the hack, but a few squadron leaders whispered about modded Mustangs with wild noses making steep, near-vertical climbs over France. Meanwhile, in the States, engineers at Wright Field had already heard of the so-called zero-boost climb. They requested data, but none was sent. Instead, they combed through maintenance reports and nose art photos to identify P-51 seconds that might have sported the airflow mod. One tech even noted, "There's a war going on, and someone just discovered a legal cheat code and we don't have the blueprint." In silence, copies were made. In the field, it was even simpler. Forward mechanics, hungry for an edge, began experimenting with their own tweaks, shaving intake edges, bending duct metals, adding homemade flow dividers. These mods were never logged, never officially endorsed, but more and more pilots began to report faster climb rates at low altitude, sharper throttle response, and more stable engine pressure under sudden ascent. One veteran, Captain Charles "Chucky" Edmonds, would later say, "Nobody admitted it, but we were all stealing from that one mechanic." Still, the danger was real. A poorly executed intake mod could choke the engine. Some units saw fatal crashes after unauthorized tweaks. Command doubled down. No field modifications without engineering review. But in practice, if it worked in combat, no one asked too many questions as long as the pilot came home. By early 1945, unofficial climb boosts were spreading like wildfire across the 8th Air Force. But no one dared call it McIntyre's mod. He was a ghost in the data. His mechanic, reassigned. The climb, erased. But the results? They were in the sky. P-51 seconds, diving into bomber formations, rocketing up through cloud banks, hitting Luftwaffe jets with surprise vertical attacks. Something had changed. Not on paper, not in strategy, but in instinct. Pilots flew differently now because someone had proven that impossible climbs weren't impossible, just unsanctioned. The engineers knew it. The test pilots knew it. And even command, in hushed conversations behind closed hangars, knew it too. Sometimes, the real breakthroughs don't come from ivory towers or policy memos. Sometimes, they come from a mechanic with a wrench, a pilot with guts, and a climb no one could explain. In a different war, at a different time, McIntyre's climb would have been front-page news. A photograph of his P-51 streaking vertically through the clouds would have headlined every war bulletin. Yank, Ace shatters climb record, or Mustang defies gravity over Holland. But in this war, with its secrets, its buried breakthroughs, and its fear of enemy imitation, silence was the order of the day. The military press corps had caught wind of the mission. McIntyre's name appeared on a short list of pilots who'd completed high-risk aerial maneuvers during Operation Market Garden. A war correspondent named Paul Landon, embedded with the 55th Fighter Group, caught a whiff of the story and requested an interview. "They say you went vertical without boost. That true?" he asked McIntyre casually on the tarmac. McIntyre just laughed. "Must have been the wind," he replied, brushing off the question like a fighter pilot brushing ice from his wings. But Landon wasn't fooled. He saw the scuffed intake housing. He overheard the ground crew whispering about the freak climb, and when he tried to file a story with the Stars and Stripes desk, it was blocked, censored, labeled operationally sensitive. Why? Because the military brass feared what would happen if the Luftwaffe got wind of it. If they realized Allied fighters had found a way, even a temporary one, to rival or surpass the Me 262 inches vertical performance, they might change tactics, push new intercept strategies, or even accelerate their own engine mod programs. The last thing Allied command wanted was a technology race with only months left in the war. Even more dangerously, if the Germans learned of the airflow trick, they might replicate it, and German mechanics were no slouches. They were improvising with fewer resources than ever, and the Reich was desperate for anything to reclaim air superiority. So, the story died on paper, but not in rumor. By December 1944, whispers of McIntyre's climb had become legend among flight crews. They called it the Phantom Climb. Nobody had seen it. Nobody had proof, but everyone claimed to know someone who'd flown with the guy. One pilot joked, "I hear he climbed so hard he left his shadow on the ground." The lack of press only fueled the myth. In barracks and officers' clubs, pilots traded theories about the mod. Some said it was an engine trick. Others claimed it was fuel chemistry. One outlandish version even claimed McIntyre used a German turbo stolen from a downed jet. Meanwhile, journalists like Landon were furious. "We've printed stories about dog mascots riding in bombers," he later wrote in a private letter. But a Mustang breaking physics in combat? Classified. Incredible. Still, the myth grew. In the British press, a satirical column referenced the climb obliquely. "One must assume the Yanks have finally taught their Mustangs to gallop vertically." In civilian life, engineers at North American Aviation began asking quiet questions about airflow, pressure spikes, and dynamic intake geometry, all without ever referencing McIntyre's mission. The press was silenced. But the idea couldn't be. Years later, after the war, when war records began to be declassified, there was still no official mention of the mod. But McIntyre's name showed up in a combat performance review, flagged only by one cryptic phrase: "Climb, profile. Irregular but successful." That one line was all anyone ever admitted. But to pilots? To engineers? To the ones who flew and fought and knew what these machines could really do? That was confirmation. Irregular but successful was code for, "This shouldn't have worked, but it did." The real press, as it turned out, was oral history. The kind passed down in hangars, over coffee, under wings. In a dusty museum years later, one veteran tour guide gestured to a P-51 and told a group of school kids, "One guy in Holland flew that sucker straight up. They never printed it. But I was there. We saw the contrail hang like a sword in the sky. No jet could touch him. No article, no headline, no fame, just a climb, and a legacy nobody could kill." After the war, the world moved quickly to forget what it didn't understand. Jet engines became the new obsession. Propeller-driven legends like the P-51 were parked in hangars, sold as scrap, or turned into race toys. And McIntyre? He vanished from the newspapers, never having appeared in the first place. But in the hangars, the myth endured not because of books or museums, but because of the people who worked with machines and air and speed. In tiny aircraft shops across the country, old warbirds were restored by men who whispered about the zero-boost climb as if it were gospel. They'd tap a Mustang's intake housing with the reverence of a holy relic. "If you know, they'd say. No blueprints survived. No official record described the exact airflow modulation, but bits and pieces of knowledge remained in anecdote, in silence, in the look a pilot gave a mechanic when he asked the right kind of question. A few brave engineers tried to reproduce the effect on civilian aircraft. In one case, a modified Mustang in Reno air races was rumored to have hit a climb profile eerily similar to McIntyre's wartime maneuver. But the pilot never confirmed how it was done. "Just clean air and guts," he said with a smile. One post-war restoration specialist, a man named Carl Vetter, swore he once found a modified Venturi intake on an old P-51 left in a scrapyard near Spokane. "It was like someone had tinkered with airflow math no one dared touch," he said. He sketched the design, studied it, tried to replicate it. But when he reached out to military archives, he hit a wall. Never existed, they told him. Probably a field repair. That phrase, field repair, became the default dismissal, as if ingenuity born under fire could be reduced to a maintenance fluke. But Vetter knew better. He and others like him spent their lives in the hangar shadows, tracing ghosts through aluminum and rivets. And then there were the pilots, aging, dying, but still sharp in memory. At a reunion in 1973, a group of World War II fighter veterans gathered in Texas. The topic of McIntyre came up not in the schedule, but over bourbon. One said, "I saw that climb. Thought the bastard was going to pierce the sun." Another leaned in, older, quieter. "He didn't do it alone," he said. "There was a kid mechanic, Barely 19 rigged the intake with a twisted piece of manifold and prayer. But names? No one remembered, or no one dared speak them. Some secrets were kept not because of orders, but because of loyalty, the unspoken bond between a pilot and the one who kept him flying. In an oral history recorded by a university in the early 2000s, a surviving member of the 354th Fighter Group finally mentioned McIntyre by name. "Best damn climb I've ever seen," he said. "We weren't supposed to talk about it. They thought it'd stir up too many questions. But I still see it when I close my eyes, that Mustang rising like it got struck by lightning. And that's where the legacy lived, not in books, not in documentaries, but in the eyes of those who saw it. A few seconds of impossible flight burned into memory, passed like contraband from one generation of aviators to the next. In more recent years, experimental pilots and aviation YouTubers have started asking about it again. Videos titled "The Climb That Never Was" or McIntyre's Forgotten Mod pop up occasionally, featuring grainy simulations and digital reconstructions. None capture the real thing, but they try. And in trying, they keep the myth alive. At an air show in Oshkosh, a replica Mustang painted in the original markings of McIntyre's plane was displayed with a small placard. Unknown mechanic, unknown mod, known outcome. And perhaps that's all it ever was meant to be, a footnote written in sky contrails. A mechanical prayer whispered at the edge of disaster, a moment that defied manuals and protocols and still, decades later, made people ask, how? Because in the end, that's the real legacy. Not just that it worked, but that it never should have. Long after the war, in engineering classrooms and design labs, young minds wrestled with equations meant to predict airflow, drag, thrust. They ran simulations, refined models, built wind tunnels that mimicked hurricane force velocity. But no matter how advanced the software became, no one could ever quite model what McIntyre's P-51 had done on that day over the skies of Market Garden. It wasn't just the climb. It was the impossible harmony of forces that shouldn't have synchronized yet did. Historians and engineers alike called it a miracle of momentary physics, a freak convergence of conditions. But for a few who dug deeper, it was something else. Proof of human intuition, overriding machine limitations. Several classified military studies in the 1,950 seconds tried to reverse engineer similar zero-boost climbs using post-war aircraft data. Declassified fragments from a 1,957 Wright-Patterson report simply noted, results inconclusive. Unknown, modification suspected. Field repairs not standard. The problem was McIntyre never left a diagram. The mechanic who helped him, unnamed in records. The Mustang itself, lost in post-war surplus auctions. What was left were fragments, eyewitness accounts, performance logs with unexplained anomalies, and whispers from old squadron techs who recalled weird welds and duct tape over a manifold intake. But no blueprint. What was suspected, however, was brilliant. Some believe the mod wasn't about pushing more power, it was about removing resistance. A re-angled intake, carved to force laminar airflow with minimal turbulence. By redirecting low-pressure zones along the wing route, the mechanic may have tricked the aircraft into thinking it was operating in thinner air. The result? An unnatural acceleration not from added thrust, but from minimized drag and reshaped lift vectors. And still, it was only speculation. One MIT aerospace professor called it a feat of cockpit sorcery. Another wrote a paper arguing that it was impossible without catastrophic engine failure, yet the plane survived and flew again. The contradiction only deepened the mystery. And then came the legends. There's one story impossible to verify that a Cold War-era Soviet pilot, during a joint exercise, recounted seeing a similar Mustang maneuver decades earlier and claimed his own engineers tried to replicate it. Allegedly, their prototype exploded on the runway. The Soviets blamed sabotage. The Americans blamed myth. But the myth endured. Pilots passed down the story to their sons. Mechanics mentioned it in hushed tones over beers. One experimental aircraft builder named Jake Whitaker even tried to recreate the airflow profile, using a modern carbon fiber kit plane. He posted the footage online showing a near-vertical climb from a standing start. It sparked debate, drew millions of views, but Whitaker refused interviews. "I just followed a whisper," he said cryptically. What became clear was that this was never about a schematic. It was about something messier, more human. It was about risk and instinct. About a mechanic willing to break rules. About a pilot willing to trust a wild fix with his life. The blueprint wasn't drawn on paper. It was drawn in courage, in desperation, in that sliver of sky between survival and loss. One final note came from a Smithsonian aviation curator who examined wartime wreckage of similar aircraft. In an interview, she said, "We've found Mustangs with unusual intake welds. None match regulation specs. Maybe it was just battlefield ingenuity. Or maybe, just maybe, one of them stumbled onto what McIntyre and his ghost mechanic already knew. In that space between fact and faith, the blueprint still floats. Uncaptured, unrepeated, undeniably real in the eyes of those who witnessed it. Because some designs can't be engineered. They have to be dared. The jet age roared into existence with sleek, thunderous force. By the early 1,950 seconds, polished aluminum arrows with swept-back wings and supersonic dreams replaced the growling prop-driven machines of World War II. The Mustang, once the apex predator of the skies, was now relegated to backlines, museums, and training programs. But something odd happened. McIntyre's name never vanished with it. Among fighter pilots transitioning to jets, his climb during Market Garden was still whispered like a riddle. Academy instructors referenced it with a mix of reverence and disbelief. One Air Force cadet from the class of '55 recalled hearing, "You want to know what commitment looks like? Ask what McIntyre did with no turbo, no boost, no margin for error." They weren't talking about machines anymore. They were talking about mindset. Jet engineers at Northrop and McDonnell were intrigued by the mysterious airflow behavior McIntyre's P-51 displayed. Some tried incorporating variable intake geometries. Others studied rapid pressure balancing systems inspired by rumors of McIntyre's modification. Though the technology moved forward, they couldn't replicate the perfect harmony of climb and control he achieved, especially not in combat conditions, with enemy fire overhead and no safety net below. Ironically, McIntyre himself faded into silence after the war. He reportedly declined interviews, refused awards, and never attended reunions. He was offered a consultancy role during the Korean War and turned it down. One letter, later discovered in an aviation historian's archive, quoted him saying, "I did what I had to. The sky doesn't care about medals. It only cares if you stay in it." But his actions echoed louder than any citation. A new generation of test pilots, those risking everything at Edwards Air Force Base, adopted what they called the McIntyre rule. It went like this: if your machine fails, trust your mind. If your mind fails, trust your gut. If all else fails, fly anyway. NASA engineers working on early supersonic prototypes like the X-1 and X-15 were known to study World War II aircraft behavior at extreme altitudes. Some believe McIntyre's vertical ascent was included in those profiles, despite lacking formal documentation. Anecdotes mention diagrams marked only with unknown P-51 climb profile. Emerg case. Even in the future, McIntyre was a ghost in the cockpit. His legend took on new life in the 1,970 seconds, when aviation magazines, hungry for war stories, ran features titled "The Man Who Climbed Without Power" and "Zero Boost." Full guts. While dramatized, they reignited curiosity. Retired mechanics came forward with fragments, bits of metalwork they swore came from that climb, modifications they were told never to repeat. Historians tried to piece together the truth, but like vapor trails, it slipped away. The story reached its cultural peak in the 1,990 seconds, when a docudrama attempted to reenact the climb using a restored P-51. Despite modern instruments, upgraded materials, and digital avionics, they couldn't match the performance McIntyre achieved in 1944. The test pilot later said, It's like chasing a ghost through a thunderstorm. Today, McIntyre's name lives on not in textbooks, but in test ranges and break rooms, in old-timers' tales and simulator training prompts. Fighter instructors refer to impossible scenarios as McIntyre missions. When pilots are faced with losing altitude, engine power, or hope, they're reminded that somewhere, once, a man with no boost found a way to go up. In 2022, a digital artist rendered a tribute, a short film visualizing McIntyre's climb as a rocket-like launch. It went viral, 12 million views in 2 weeks. Young audiences, far removed from the war, commented things like, "I'd trust McIntyre over autopilot any day, and he flew the soul of the aircraft." That, perhaps, is McIntyre's greatest legacy. He reminded generations that at the heart of every machine is a human soul, a will that defies prediction and refuses to surrender. His climb wasn't about physics. It was about faith in his craft, in his crew, in himself. And so, when pilots today hit turbulence, when engines sputter or warnings blare, a few still mutter one line under their breath. Climb it McIntyre style, because legends don't retire, they ascend.